Hello everyone, welcome back to Florence, Italy, and welcome back into the studio. Today we're continuing with the female figure in the Chronos composition. A little jump back in time here, as you can see in the torso perhaps. We're going back in time to work on the arm a little bit more and progress its block in so that it can become ready to have the treatment we just did in the torso done to it, the arm, as well. I thoroughly enjoy working in different tempos, in different places. Certain kinds of work, sculpting work that is, require a certain type of energy and attention, and it can be tough to maintain that energy throughout a whole day. By having the sculpture in slightly different phases in different places, you can circumvent this problem somewhat. I get a lot of questions about armature wire, as it can be hard to find good aluminum armature wire out there, especially of the thicker gauges. If you look at the bottom of the picture here, you'll see that the armature for the arm is currently sticking out of the clay of the forearm. I sculpt from the center out, so I'm holding off on sculpting the wrist and hand for now. The wire in this section is doubled up, which is something I often do to create a stronger wire. The two wires are bound together with hose clamps or zip ties, or just with a thinner wrapping wire in some cases, depending on the amount of space I have within the arm itself. More room means a more thorough connection with a stronger material, like hose clamps for example, so that's what I've gone with here for the most part. I double the armature wire up because I don't have thicker wire, I think, and doubling up gives a stiffer and stronger arm that flexes less. You will see the arm flex a little bit here when I'm applying pressure to it, adding clay to it essentially, but not so much that it's a problem. If it was swaying in the wind, essentially, it would be a problem. It could be a problem. The arm is all about rhythm and flow of form. A typical mistake with the arm is to make it stiff and round, and thus very boring, of course. In order to make it exciting and interesting, I'm going to be looking for rhythm. So the first thing to think about when doing arms is bending the joints to create rhythm. A bent arm is in most cases going to look more interesting than a straight arm. However, here I have a straight arm, but I've bent it despite of it being straight, if you will. This bend is at the elbow, and it's often called the angle of carriage, or at least that's what I was told it was called, even though I've only heard it from one teacher. And it can be used to great effect to create interest when the arm is straight. The second piece of the puzzle when it comes to creating interesting arms is making sure the contours are interesting. In order to make them interesting, you should look for evidence of contour that on either side of the arms have high points that sit at an angle to each other and not directly across from each other. You can see here how I'm trying to make sure that the high points along the contour sit at an angle to each other as we travel up the arm, or down the arm. This is not only anatomically correct, in most cases at least, but also visually pleasing to the eye. It's very easy to miss, since it tends to be subtle, and if you do this with an emphasis on making sure these angle breaks exists, your sculpture will be better for it. Not thinking about something like this while carefully trying to observe reference has the tendency to end you up in a place where you sculpt this effect perhaps, but with 3 to 5% less punch than it needs. Finally, of course, we have to consider anatomy as we're making the arm here. The anatomy should ideally support what we already know from above and what we see in and on our reference. Key things to consider is the fact that in order for the muscles to mobilize the arm, they have to stretch across the joints themselves. Muscles function as mechanical levers in that sense, and if you don't let the evidence of this show in your work, it can easily look like the limbs are not actually capable of moving. There is the overlap at the elbow, where the brachioradialis and the extensor carpi radialis longus stretch across the joint of the elbow. Hopefully I pronounced those names correctly. While often appearing as one form, at least on most of us, unless we flex these muscles, they're vital in creating the appearance that the arm can move. Even if there are many more muscles that are much more responsible for moving the arm at the elbow joint, this one is visually the one that's going to help the most, I think. We also have a joint that students struggle with a lot at the shoulder, and a key thing to consider here is that the deltoid or shoulder muscle itself actually inserts onto the clavicle in the front, which we can't see here, of course, and the scapula in the back, which we can see here, of course. Making sure this occurs can help a common issue of the shoulder itself floating outside the body and thus becoming disconnected from the rest of the figure. This is a pretty common issue which partially occurs because when observing reference from life, the model will often move. Sculpting really well requires you to have vision that see things on many levels, if you will. Not just visually observing reference, be it from a live model or from photographs, not just knowledge of anatomy, not just knowledge of the structures of the body and how they're put together, and not just knowledge of the tricks that can help a piece look appealing. It requires us to wear all of those lenses at the same time, or at least be capable of switching in between them frequently. It is therefore a very difficult thing to get good at, since paying attention to all of these things at the same time requires a lot of brain power to be used in the beginning when it doesn't happen subconsciously, which it will eventually if you practice enough. A project such as this exercises all of these skills and forces us to apply them. Let's first talk about the differences between bone and flesh, since we're working on the extended side of the body where the ribs are more readily visible to us without a lot of muscles on top interfering, which is what we find on the compressed side of the body, of course, which is the other side, the left side in this instance. Sculpture isn't real, of course. It's just clay or whatever other material you cast it in, plaster, bronze. And so in some way, when we make something, a sculpture, we try to make it look real since we're representational sculptors. And this quest for making something look real is of course dominated perhaps by observing a model, but there are certain things that we can simply know or know works and therefore allow to become implemented regardless of the model which we do observe. One of the things we are looking to describe is the difference between bone and flesh. It's true that if you look for something, you're likely going to find it to some extent. So, by looking for certain things that we tend to think differentiates bones from flesh, we're very likely going to see some of these things or notice some of these things on our model as well. A big one evident here on the extended side of the body is the fact that bones tend to be sitting at a slightly greater distance from each other than muscles do. Muscles have a slightly shorter transition and are more bunched up against each other, while bones are usually less so and with a bit of a broader zone or a flat region reserved for the transitions between them. This is perhaps especially evident when the bones are lining up one after the other, like they are here in the ribs on the extended side of the body and in the ribs visible at the sternum. While the difference is subtle, perhaps, these subtle differences are going to be the things that tell the viewers subconsciously what it is that him or her are actually looking at. And thus, hopefully, they will become convinced that what they're looking at is real, even though they know it's not. There are, of course, plenty of other things we consider when communicating this difference between bone and flesh. For example, the shape design plays a huge role in whether or not something appears as bone or flesh. Shape design that's more symmetrical and looks to have more, or have been influenced less rather, by gravity is going to do wonders for you here if you're trying to say bone. A bone that looks like it's sagging, for example, is not really going to convince anyone, is it? We've mentioned planes before, and this is also something to consider as the plane changes on bones are often slightly different than what they look like and where they occur on muscles and fat. For flesh, the plane changes, the volume itself, is often influenced by gravity or by the action that the pose dictates is taking place. But bones, of course, are not changed by gravity and only have their position changed when action takes place. Their shape is not influenced by movement as they do not bend, they do not compress, and they do not extend. At least not under normal use, let's say. Finally, we can use texture to help sell the illusion of skin being pulled tightly across a bone that reaches the surface. Technically, this is mostly achieved, or I mostly achieve this effect, by how smooth the surface is in any given area. Smoother textures mean skin is being pulled tight over something hard like bone, and a slightly more bumpy texture is going to be skin bunching up over soft tissue. If you think about it, representational sculpture is all about the illusion of reality. Everything we do is therefore aimed at creating something believable for the audience, and everything we do should have that consideration taken into account. Creating a solid sense of the eternal plays a part in that, selling that illusion. The shape design describing the difference between bones and flesh plays a part in that illusion. A unified surface without big holes in it plays a part in that illusion. And the final surface texture plays a role in that illusion. Everything should work in unison to create the effect of reality, and thus, of course, representation. That's it for today's video. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you learned a thing or two that you can take with you into your own practice. Until next time, stay creative.